Welcome to 1+1. I'm Kurt Fearnley. Madison de Rozario is an athlete at the top of her game. World champion, Commonwealth Games Champion, and Paralympic Champion, as well as the winner of New York and London marathons. But you know what the best thing is about Madison? She isn't even close to being done yet.
Representing Australia, Madison de Rozario.
Madison de Rozario from Australia.
Madison de Rozario, you are the winner.
Madison de Rozario, welcome to 1+1.
Thanks for having me.
So you've won the Paralympic Marathon, the Commonwealth Games Marathon, the New York Marathon, London Marathon, but I have to ask, who is the greatest wheelchair marathon of all time?
I mean, I'm going to have to say it's Louise Sauvage, without question.
Correct answer. Who is Louise Sauvage to you?
Louise is my coach, but she's also someone who I think has probably had the biggest impact in making me the athlete I am. And I don't think in necessarily the normal way of coach and athlete. I think she's someone who kind of allowed me the space to work out who I wanted to be as an athlete. And I don't think that that's a luxury that every single one of us as athletes necessarily get. I did nearly step away from the sport after the London Games. I thought that it wasn't for me. I knew physically I could make it work, and I thought that I was always told I had a lot of talent and a lot of potential, and I could see that. I just didn't think mentally I really was going to be able to go as far as I wanted to in that space. And finally it was Louise who sat me down, and we had a conversation about what I needed from the sport and what I needed to do in order to actually go as far as she saw me going. She's definitely always seen so much more in me than I ever have, and we reworked what I needed to be as an athlete. I think I'd been in the sport for so long that it had become who I was, and I hadn't taken the time to work out who I was outside of it. And I don't think you can give everything you need to give as an athlete if you don't know who you are outside of that. And so we took the time to do that, and it was Louise that provided me the space to actually be able to do that.
Before that, were you comparing where you wanted to go to where Louise had been?
I spent the first half of my career being compared to Louise, and I think being coached by her, it's an easy kind of parallel to make. But it was also something that I had growing up before sport was even a part of my life. I think Louise was the only person in any kind of spotlight that looked anything like me. And so when other people would see me, it was before I'd even seen a racing chair, it was she might be the next Louise Sauvage. And it was the most bizarre kind of world to then fall into, to have that relationship with Lou that had been my entire life growing up. And so yeah, there was definitely a lot of that, and it was never going to happen. Lou and I have had success for such different reasons, and there isn't much overlap in the reasons or the way we approach sport at all.
How did you get involved in sport?
I've played sports since I was a kid, just for the first half of my life, very badly.
Disabled sport?
No, so I didn't find wheelchair sports until I was about 11 or 12. And not for any reason other than I didn't have a specific interest in being good at sport. I just wanted to do whatever my sisters were doing. And so we were always really active. Both my parents played, sport growing up and into being adults, and both my sisters as well. So I would just jump on board with whatever it is that they were doing, that they found interesting at the time. But I tried basketball a lot, and only because a lot of the kind of girls I'd grown up with going through wheelchair sports camps were a part of that team, and like a lot of them now are a part of the gliders. But it was definitely not a fit, and it took the man that was coaching kind of the development basketball, Frank Ponta, to pull me aside and tell me that I was terrible at it. And I can't remember his words exactly, but basically it was like, you're not an asset to this team. Do you want to try something else? which is like the nicest way you can tell a 12-year-old, please stop.
So he also told me that I was terrible at basketball and I need to get into athletics, into track.
Well, he's got an eye for it, obviously.
He was a recruiter.
He was, but he covered all the wheelchair sports in WA, and so he had a track chair in the storage room at the basketball courts, and I jumped in the parking lot, and it was far too big, but I kind of just did like laps of the parking lot, and yeah, no, fell in love with it.
Often disability sport is kind of like a rehabilitation, you know, it's seen that way. Is it?
The minute you have a disability, you lose some kind of autonomy over your voice and over your body, and it's incredibly hard to reclaim that. And if you're not going to actively reclaim that, you're going to exist in a world not assuming you deserve it either, and never fighting for the space that you deserve and you belong in. And I think sport is a really easy way to reclaim that bodily autonomy that's kind of taken away from us, either, you know, as we've grown up or the minute we acquire a disability. And I think sport, you have to take ownership of your body, and that's something that we do take away from people with disabilities. And so, yeah, I think it's important for every single person, but I think more so for people with disabilities, and I also think for girls as well. It's another thing that girls do struggle with a lot, is we don't have tons of control over our bodies and how we're viewed and how we're expected to be. And so we kind of have this disconnect from our physical selves, and sport is one of the easiest ways and healthiest ways to kind of reclaim that.
Some family plays a role in understanding disability when you're growing up with the disability. How did your family respond to disability within the household?
They basically didn't, and I think that's why it made it work so well.
What do you mean by that?
I didn't even realize that something that could have potentially been viewed as traumatic had happened until I understood what disability was when I was a lot older. I never thought about it as something that could even possibly be bad, because it was just who I was.
Had your family ever experienced disability before?
They have, in that my mum's first language is Auslan, so both of her parents are deaf, and I didn't even draw that parallel probably until in my 20s, because I think the way I view disability, my family does, is everything is so individual, everything its own thing, every single person is so multifaceted, and disability shouldn't be an umbrella that we kind of put every single person with a disability under. And so I never really realized that I had that in common with my grandparents. We both had a disability until I kind of put that together much later than I should have.
Madison, what is your disability?
How are you waiting to throw that question in for? It's not happening.
So, I have never asked that question on this show.
Such a good track record.
But why are we laughing?
Because it is the most ridiculous question. I feel like it's one of those questions that we all want to ask, and we're none the better after we've asked it. It doesn't serve any purpose, and yet it's the one that we want to ask immediately, and it's...
But we don't. Like, I'd never asked you.
No.
I'd never asked any
Because-
person on the Paralympic team before. But when I see now you're outside the team and you watch it on telly, it's the first question that's asked. Like, every story seems to be framed around that.
Because we've decided that is an interesting question to ask. We decided that disability is the most interesting thing about a person with a disability, when it couldn't be farther from the truth. And it's an important part of identity for sure, and it's important to understand. But how someone acquired their disability or the specifics of it, it couldn't be less interesting.
When you do say it can be an important part of our identity as well, how much is that tied in with who you are? How much is your disability a part of who you are right now?
It's a huge part, but I wouldn't even be able to say how much, because it's been just every single part of my life. It's so much as a part of who I am as anything else. I wouldn't even know where the rest of me ends and that begins. It's just so much a part of who I am. And I think I'm an incredibly proud woman with a disability. It's such a... I wouldn't separate myself from that, so I wouldn't even be able to tell you how much of me that is. It's just very much one and the same.
What about how do you think you're seen?
Well, that's where that question comes into it, doesn't it? That's the difference, where anyone who sees me, sees any person with a visible disability, that is the first thing we see, and it's what we base every decision we make on how to interact with that person after that. And it's becomes every part of who they are, and we don't let that person escape that. And the biggest problem with that we run into is if we do that to young kids with disabilities, you begin to internalize that, and you create this community of people with internalized ableism that becomes as much a part of them as how I would describe my disability as part of me. And to then separate yourself from that is a losing battle. Like, that's the biggest fight you will ever have within your own body. And that's, I think, what all of us are trying to change right now. And that's, I think, the big stigma that we're trying to remove, is that we view disability as this negative but also interesting thing that must consume a person, because that's the way that we view it, and that's the way that we're constantly shown to view it in every kind of media that we see, is disability as interesting and as bad. And so how do you escape that if that's the world that you've grown up in? And then what you end up doing is, out 20% of Australians with disabilities, we begin telling that story as well. And so there's no one really offering any kind of different view of that. And so it's just this cycle that we fall into, where disability almost overshadows the rest of every single part of your identity, and not in a good way.
Tell me about that. Tell me about how, when you go into a room, what part of your identity is overlooked?
So I think the best way to describe this is to use my sisters as examples, because there's three of us, we're all so similar in age, we've grown up in such similar circumstances, and we look basically exactly the same, the three of us. The one difference is obviously I'm in a chair. And they both identify very strongly as women of colour. That's their first and foremost thing about themselves, is they're women and they're women of colour, and that's what they've shaped their identity around, and that's how they're treated as well. Whereas I've never really even considered that part of my identity to be huge, because I've never been treated like it's important. And so for myself, it goes disability first, how I'm viewed, and then a woman, and then person of colour, if it even gets a look in. And so you don't get to lean into every part of who you are when that's how we're treating somebody. If we're forcing them to identify so strongly with one part of them, we don't allow them the space to work out who they really are outside of that. And it's damaging, not just to that individual, but to the community they exist in. People are so much more valuable to themselves, to everybody, if we're really allowed to embrace every part of who we are, and we don't allow that when we force one identity on somebody.
I feel like, you mentioned it earlier on, where it's like we start to buy into it sometimes, you know? Like, we're presented with this binary choice. You are either going to be the victim or the hero, or you're the story that will be the tragic story or the inspirational story.
I think we find it really difficult as a society to separate trauma from disability, and I think that's the center of that problem. And we either view disability as bad, as something that we don't want to be our future. We don't want that to happen to us. We view it as a negative, or we view it as something that has been overcome in the most amazing way, and we try and view that person in like a heroic light almost. The problem with that is we're still viewing the disability as bad in that second light, and there is no escape from that when we view it as bad. We view it as just this terrible thing. When it comes to separating trauma from disability, trauma needs to be overcome. It's something that we experience in our lives, then we move on from at some point, whatever process that requires. Disability for most of us is like an incredibly permanent fixture in our lives. And so when we tell someone to, I think, we've all been asked those questions, Paralympians, like, how has sport helped you overcome your disability? While you're standing in front of them with a very clear disability still. And that bothers me, because they don't mean that. They don't mean how did you overcome your disability. They mean how did you overcome the trauma associated with it. But we tie disability into that. And so there's no escape from this negative stigma that we create for that word. And the reality is, not all of us actually have trauma associated with our disability. There were so many of us who are either born with it, or for myself, I was 3. My parents had to carry that, and they did. And I never had to deal with it. I don't have trauma associated with acquiring my disability. And so
we got trauma associated with lots of other stuff, but not the disability.
Well, exactly.
What about, where's the way out? Like, how do we get out of this idea that you are either one or the other? Because we know that that's...
employment. It's like the obvious answer, and it's one that we kind of skate over a little bit. I think we all want to do, big things and campaigns and like, let's talk about this and change it. And you or I could get up in front of a room of thousands and say all the right things, and it wouldn't have the same impact as going to work and working alongside somebody with a disability 9 to 5. It's a discomfort that we have, and you don't ease discomfort by being told that it's wrong. You ease it by exposure and by experiencing that, and we need to kind of normalize humans in, you know, the multifaceted ways they exist, and right now we don't do that. We shy away from it. We don't want to ask the questions. There is this discomfort that we have, and the easiest way to fix that is employment. It's working alongside somebody and just kind of, I don't know, diving into that.
How does body image and like learning a sense of who you are while being a person with a disability, especially in teenage years, how does that come together?
That's, I think body image is a really tricky one, and it's a really complicated one. And it's something that absolutely every person is going to face at some point in their lives. And generally it's when we're in our teenage years. That's where it's, you know, we're the most insecure and kids are the meanest. Like, that's definitely where it all happens. On top of that, as a girl, our entire value is based in the way that we look. That's how we exist. And we start telling girls that from an incredibly young age, that how they look is actually really important and will change the way they get treated. You have more value, you get treated better, there's more opportunities, the better you look. And not just the better you look, there's a specific look as well. It's not just good, it's in a very specific direction. And as a girl with a disability, it's completely unattainable. And it's unattainable for most girls. It's not realistic, but it's one that we do force on people. And so for me as a girl with a disability, it was a bit of a losing battle, and it was incredibly challenging. I think a lot of my worth was tied into that, and for me it took sport to come out of that, where you can't, you know, give everything to sport and expect your body to give you everything that it needs to give out on the track, out on the road, if you're not having that love and respect for it. But it shouldn't take sport, it shouldn't take going to a Paralympic Games to really kind of come to that realization. I didn't come to it until maybe after my second Games. Like, it wasn't like a quick decision or, you know, a quick change of like mindset the minute I got into it. It took a long time, and it got in the way for the longest time. And we see girls in sport, we're losing girls in sport at such a rapid pace. The minute we get into teenage years, we're losing numbers, because getting stronger and bigger is, you know, we've decided it's unattractive. And so we lose girls, and owning that is what we need to be doing. And it's an incredibly, incredibly difficult thing to do.
Are we making ground there? There's a Madison de Rozario Barbie. You know, like, what impact would have that made on you as a kid to see stuff like that?
It is getting better. We are seeing more people with disabilities everywhere we look, but we're seeing a very specific kind of person with disability everywhere we look. And oftentimes it is athletes, and it's also people who do fit that body image that we hold able-bodied people to, just the disabled version of it. So it is getting better, but there is still so much space that needs to be covered. We're not representing everybody in disability in 100% of our community. We're not representing every single person that we see, and we are still a long way from doing that. But it's something that is going to be slow progress. But we are it is moving in a really good direction.
I find it quite interesting that we're sitting here as Paralympians, some has-been Paralympians, some obviously very current successful Paralympians, yet we would completely agree that to make real change, you need to have real relationships with people with disabilities on the ground on a day-to-day basis at your workplace. So you may celebrate the Paralympics as much as you like, and we want you to, but do you agree?
Yeah, and we hold disability to this ridiculously high standard, and it's our Paralympians. It's not something that we do for the other 80% of Australians, but we do for our 20% with disabilities. And it's shifted, because like when I grew up, disability wasn't elite sport. It was, you know, someone who was going to be very dependent on their family, on communities, you know, for the rest of their lives. And that is a small part of our community, absolutely, but it's not the entirety of it. And we're not embracing disability exists on such a spectrum, and we don't embrace all of it. We kind of just pick and choose what part of it we like at the moment. And I think focusing historically on parts of disability that required support allowed us to kind of push it to the side. And whereas now we're doing that in a completely different way where, you know, disability is elite sport and we can celebrate that very separate to ourselves, not actually leaning into it or embracing it. And we've missed all of these people in the middle. And we need people in workplaces. We need not just the 80% to ease their discomfort, we need pathways for the 20% of people with disabilities growing up. And like I remember thinking, and all my friends in high school were getting their casual jobs, and thankfully I was already racing and I didn't have to think about that too much. But I remember thinking, like, what would I even do? There was no one that looked like me in any of the jobs my friends were doing, and you could see barriers to me actually being able to do any of those things. And I didn't have friends with disabilities, so I could see what they were doing, and it just wasn't something that we would ever see. So how do we expect someone to kind of follow the pathway that everyone else is creating and we're expected to? And then how do you expect somebody to, you know, I think completing, you know, your tertiary education is challenging. It's, you know, it's so easy to want to kind of not do that. And if you don't know what that's going to look like when you're done, that's such a huge task to take on without even knowing if there's going to be any possibilities for you when you finish. And so how do we expect our 20% to actually want to pursue that and then, you know, be able to live and exist with, you know, with dignity in communities, and we're not actually allowing any visibility in any pathways.
So why would you study to become a doctor when you've never seen a doctor that looks like you?
Well, exactly.
So why invest these 6 years to even try?
Absolutely. It's almost an insurmountable challenge if you can't see the end of it.
Well, you say about you already had a part-time job. I think it was you already had a job when you were 14 years old. Your job was being a Paralympian. You came into the team 14, into Beijing in 2008. How do you reflect on those years?
It was honestly a massive whirlwind. Like, it's all a bit surreal. Like, I think about it now. I also meet 14-year-olds now, and I'm like, how was I doing this at that age? It was a lot. But it was also, I think it all happened so fast that we kind of just went with it, to be honest. I definitely wasn't planning on going to Beijing. I started working with Louise that year, and we were definitely training with, you know, London as the first games in mind, and, you know, see how it kind of went in the lead up. And it was only through the relay that I really got a spot on that team, and we were one of the last athletes selected. I think Jemima was the other younger athlete. I think she was 16, I was 14. And we were only going to go off the relay, went ahead. And so, yeah, I think it was only a couple months out we got the call.
Over the 13 years from Beijing, from your first Paralympic final, you would become world champion, world record holder,
Ooh.
Commonwealth Games champion, yet the gold medal at the Paralympics had eluded you just. Were you feeling the pressure when you got to Tokyo?
This hurts just a little bit to talk about. Yes, there was a lot of pressure because I'd almost done it in Rio. I had come so close to doing it in Rio, as close as you possibly could. It was definitely a very long 5-year wait to be able to, you know, get to Tokyo and do it again. I think knowing you have potential to be able to do that and not having any opportunity to actually do that, you know, the Paralympics obviously don't come around particularly often, so it was definitely a lot. And going into it, yeah, I knew I wanted to win it, and I'd never been in a position where I'd be upset with a silver medal. And that's something that I found really hard to deal with. I actually spent a lot of time talking to my sports psych before heading over, and the psych in the village, about how do I process this if there is a better athlete than me on the day, because it's entirely likely there's 7 other women out there who are absolutely incredible, and I think there was going to be like 4 of us who'd held the world record in the last 3 years lining up, you know, on that day. And a lot of work we'd done was how do we deal with it if it doesn't kind of come together on the day. And I was putting a lot of pressure on myself, but there was also a lot of some expectation, but also I think just absolute faith that I'd be able to do it from around me. And that's a mix of stressful and the most amazing support you could possibly have going into that. But yeah, it was definitely intense.
Is it almost trying to see whether it's, like, I remember trying to process whether or not it's okay to be sad with the silver medal.
And the thought of having to do that on television and having to kind of, how do you come across? Like, I knew I'd be devastated,
Yeah.
but that almost seems like the most unsportsmanlike thing you could possibly do in front of, like, you know, in every television in Australia to come across like that. That was definitely a thought.
How did the gold medal feel, the first one that you got in the 800 metres?
It was the first race I'd won on a big stage where I didn't feel relieved to win it. which was amazing. And I think because I knew a little way out that I had a bit of a gap, and that I think I processed that relief somewhere in the race in the last 100 meters. And that had never happened before. I think it had always been, so close and you wanted it so badly, and to finally do it, it is relief. And I don't think anyone really prepares you for that going into sport. And I remember, I think the shock of that the first time it happened, where you weren't really happy or proud, it was just pure relief. And so that gold medal, I think, that stands out so much because it was the first time I crossed line first, and it wasn't just relief. I was actually, happy.
Where do you want the Paralympic movement to head over the next 10 years?
I think there's a lot of space for us to learn how we want to treat every single person within our communities that we all want to do, but we don't know how to do. There is so much discomfort that we have with, and I'm not talking just disability, I'm talking every single minority. And I think, the best example of this is all the movement that, the women's movement is making right now. And I think following that trajectory, I see every single one of us, kind of every minority group moving through that. But I feel like it's happening so separately right now, with women being at the forefront of that, people of colour, that movement, and then, disabilities trailing a little bit in that space. And because it's so complicated and there's so, we do exist on such an enormous spectrum, and it's, it's hard to kind of create unity when it's all so individual. And I think that all needs to move as one movement, though. And I think, we almost all have the responsibility to carry the rest with us, because the same fight we're all fighting with different language and slightly different, platforms, but it's the exact same. And I think that's the thing that I've learned in the past few years. And, I sit in these meetings with, women in business, and how do we move this forward? It's the same conversations we're trying to have on the Paralympic side, but we're not having them together. We're not learning from each other what works, what doesn't, who can actually, impact change. And I want to see all of that start moving together, because I think it's gonna speed up all of it, because it is the exact same fight.
I never thought about that, because we are seeing this big progression of things, but often where people with disabilities are kind of
Trailing.
too complicated to fit in there, or the belief that we are.
Yeah, I think we shy away from things that are complicated. I think, think about the space that each one, is at. We're saying, let's employ more women in CEO roles and those high decision-making roles. Where on the disability side, we're just begging to be employed full stop.
Get us in the front door.
Exactly. So it's the same thing. It's just years and years behind. And I think it could all move together. We're making the decisions where, we're making structural changes to allow space for people that aren't who designed it. But we're not allowing everyone through the door just yet. And I think that's something that could change, and it will change so much faster, and we'll be better off, not just our 20%, but as an entire community, if we can keep moving that.
How many more Paralympics could we see you at?
So when Brisbane was announced, there was definitely a small part of me that was like, maybe we could do that. It's a long way away though. I'll be 38. In Brisbane.
I finished when I was 38.
I know, and so did Chantal. So it's not unrealistic.
No.
It's definitely possible, but I do know that I want to be doing something every day that I love, and is, I'm moving in a direction and forces me to keep kind of growing and improving and being better. And so, if that ever stops, then I'll step away and I'll do something else. But for now, I'm telling Louise that she's not allowed to retire until after Brisbane either. We are locked into this together.
Well, I look forward to somebody in the ABC replaying this the night before your final marathon in 2032. It's hard to believe that we could only be at the midpoint of your career. I cannot wait to see what happens next, and thanks for joining me on 1+1.
Thank you.